Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the June meeting of the Valley of the Sun Deconstruction and Reuse Work Group. We have two special guest presenters with us today. We have Gretchen Worth, who's the director of the Christopherson Center for Community Planning and a board member of Restoration Works International, and Andrew Roblee, who's founder and president of Roblee Historic Preservation and the current president of the Preservation Association of Central New York, PACNY. The Christopherson Center and PACNY are founding partners of CROWD, which is short for Circularity, Reuse, Zero Waste Development. And it's a statewide collaborative network that's creating a circular economy, a circular construction economy in New York State and beyond. Today, Gretchen and Andrew will be sharing how vacant public schools can become circularity centers that promote and enable the scaling of deconstruction and building material reuse and convert currently landfilled and incinerated materials into valuable community resources. But before we turn things over to Gretchen and Andrew, and as folks arrive and settle in, we'll set just a little bit of context. Who or what is the Valley of the Sun Work Group? We are located in the Phoenix, Arizona metropolitan area. We spotlight deconstruction, reuse, and sustainability progress, plans, and goals as models for broader consideration and implementation. We welcome participants wherever you are, and we invite you to join us on LinkedIn to share and promote your deconstruction, reuse, and sustainability efforts. And I'll put a link in the chat in just a few minutes. We also invite you to email us with suggestions or questions or ideas for our meetings. I'll put that link in the chat as well. Meetings are sponsored by Stardust, which is a nonprofit in the Phoenix area for over 28 years, starving the landfill and making quality used building materials available for reuse in the community via 2 retail centers. This will be our last meeting for a few months. We typically take the months of July and August for a summer break. So our next meeting will actually be Monday, September 8th. And we are having a focused session about Home Builders Can. This is a community of practice to measure and reduce embodied carbon in home construction. It's powered by RMI and an industry stakeholder group, and we'll be sharing more information with you in advance of that so you can register for that session. But coming back to today, we'd like to learn a bit more about our participants and have you really meet each other. This is a community. It's good to know and connect with each other. You never know when you're going to discover somebody in one of these sessions that you want to have a follow-up conversation or connection with later. So please share your name, your organization, and your location in the chat. And we will be sharing the Zoom chat with all of the meeting registrants, just as we will be sharing the link for the recording. But as you introduce yourselves in the chat, we're going to conduct 2 polls to learn what part of the country or world you're in and what organizations or sectors you represent. Every one of our meetings draws a little different combination of folks from backgrounds and geographies, and it's always worthwhile to know what's appealing to whom. The first question is pick one. This is what geography, what best indicates the area that you serve or represent. And we have the different pieces of the United States as well as the overall country or also outside of the United States. And I believe Lauren, thank you, Lauren, has already launched our poll. We'll give folks a few minutes to respond, or a few moments anyhow. And Lauren, whenever you feel like you have a reasonable representation, maybe you can share with us what the inputs were.
You got it. It actually looks like most of everybody has already answered. And so far, it looks like we have the Northeast region of the United States as the most people that are joining us today.
Great, thank you. The next question, the first one you had to pick one answer, which is where you are or what you represent. The next question allows you to identify what organizations or sectors you represent. And we realize many of you wear multiple hats, so please go ahead and select multiple responses if relevant. And I'll leave it with you, Lauren. Wow, it looks like we've got a pretty good distribution in terms of backgrounds. Okay. Are we good, Lauren?
Yes, looks like it.
Okay. And if you can share results so other folks are able to see it.
And there we are.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for sharing that information with us. Okay. Coming to today's meeting, as I mentioned, we will be sharing the recording link and the chat afterwards to folks who've registered. Gretchen and Andrew do have prepared materials to share, but we have reserved time for questions and conversation afterwards. So while Gretchen and Andrew are presenting, go ahead, please, and type any questions or comments into the chat, and that way we won't lose track of them, and we'll be able to come back to them as they hit their break points. To make things as easy and comfortable and relaxed as possible for everybody, we really prefer to keep control of your phone, of your volume and your cameras with you. So just be aware, standard Zoom protocol, and if you've got noise, please make sure you mute. There will be a brief survey, I think it's 7 questions at the end of the meeting, that allows you to give feedback not only to help us continue to improve these meetings, but any feedback or questions for Gretchen or Andrew, as well as the opportunity, if you've got a topic that you would like to share, to present to the group at one of our future meetings. So, as I mentioned, today's meeting, transforming vacant public schools into circularity centers. Gretchen Worth and Andrew Roblee, who I introduced earlier, I think they will share you a little bit more about their backgrounds with you. Let me go ahead and turn it over first. I think, Gretchen, you are up, and please share your slides.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you to Valley of the Sun and everyone for inviting us here today so that Andy and I can share with you a project that is very near and dear to our hearts. So this is talking about, as Kathy mentioned, transforming vacant public schools into building circularity centers. And so just to give you some context for where we are located in our situation and our findings here, Andy and I, as Kathy mentioned, and our respective organizations are both founding partners of the Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development Network, CROWD. It's a collaborative network across New York State, which is supporting and advocating for a circular construction economy. CROWD started out a few years ago with members in the central New York area, where both Andy and myself are located in the Finger Lakes. And over the past few years has grown so that we have members or partners joining us from virtually every region of New York State across all different sectors: planners, architects, reuse and salvage professionals, preservationists, municipal staff, state agency staff, academics, students, just a wide variety of people that bring a lot of commitment to this effort. And we work in 4 main areas: policy development at the state and local level, education and engagement, the development of a workforce, as well as infrastructure, which is really a very significant piece of what we're talking with you about today, and then research and data analysis. And so if you're on this call, this number is absolutely familiar to you. I am aware of that, but I just always feel like it's good to see that and recognize the horror involved in it, acknowledge that, and that we really are trying to divert and reuse this enormous amount of building materials that are going to our landfills. In New York State, this 19 million tons has grown a bit more. We're now over 20. And so that's where we sit in New York State in terms of the material stream that we're talking about. One of the reasons that we are really interested in looking statewide at vacant public schools is because in New York State, there is there is interest in and commitment to a statewide approach to supporting local municipalities in their efforts to create a circular construction economy. So in New York State, we have a climate act, which puts in place certain targets and goals in terms of carbon reduction and so on. We have a solid waste management plan, 10 years, released in December 2023, which is entitled Building the Circular Economy Through Sustainable Materials Management. And our colleagues at the DEC who join us in our crowd efforts are incredibly committed and a really critical part of this work. Our state development authority, which funds enormous infrastructure projects around the state, through our outreach at Crowd, have begun to incorporate language into major funding opportunities that talks to this idea of building reuse, of building material diversion from our landfills. So that's a great step in terms of the new builds that are happening. We have a really active state association for reduction, reuse, and recycling, NICE-R3. And we also have a really active group of colleagues in New York City, Reclaim NYC, which is a slightly different beast when it comes to circular construction economy than the rest of the state, which is more suburban. And so we work really closely with our colleagues downstate at Reclaim NYC. We also are really fortunate in New York State to have two very committed state legislature members. The woman pictured here at the top, Anna Kellis, represents my district in the assembly. The gentleman pictured on the bottom represents parts of New York City in the Senate. And during this particular legislative session, they have introduced 4 different pieces of legislation, which speaks to the creation of a circular construction economy, as well as embodied carbon issues. And I won't go into all of this, but this is really just to paint the picture for you that there is absolutely statewide appetite in certain sectors and in certain agencies to try to come up with statewide solutions that can support our local municipalities in their efforts. So as everybody knows, reuse facilities, no matter where they're located, always need more space. And that is no different in New York State. We are fortunate to have a number of really great reuse facilities, and you're probably familiar with many of these. In Ithaca, where I sit, Finger Lakes reuse is really considered, a leader in this field nationally and internationally. And so you probably either know Diane Cohen or you've heard her speak. She spoke last week on a NERC call with Karen at Stardust, in fact. So that it's great to have them here. Big reuse in New York City, reuse action in Buffalo. These are 3 of the bigger ones. They all deal with building materials to a greater or lesser extent, and they will all tell you they don't have enough space. We also have a number of new organizations and municipalities that want to launch reuse facilities in their particular community and are facing some challenges in doing that around getting enough space. And it's not like New York State doesn't have enough empty space. We have million square foot manufacturing facilities that have moved out of state that are empty. We have big box stores that have gone out of business that are empty. In New York State, we are sitting in a pretty rural agricultural environment. We have large scale chicken farms that no longer operate, but have infrastructure on the site that could at a stretch be used for a reuse facility. So we do have certainly plenty of existing vacant infrastructure. One of the other things we have in New York State, across the state, are vacant public schools. And so it's really, and this is, Andy and I started this project for a lot of different reasons, but one was that because very near, between where I live and where Andy lives, you can drive that road and you can see, depending on the route you're taking, 3 to 6 vacant schools within a 45-mile drive. And so this really is an issue, for a lot that affects many, many communities. It are this large number of vacant public schools. And when a school closes, it really creates a sense of loss in the community. These were community hubs. They were more than just a place where kids went to get educated. They functioned as so many different uses for that particular community, regardless of the size of the community and the size of the school body. There's some other commonalities they have as well, though. They all have, in the study that we have done, large square footages. generally speaking, in New York State, the schools that we looked at were between 30,000 and 60,000 square feet. There were certainly ones that were less, and there were certainly ones that were more, but the 30 to 60,000 square foot size was kind of the sweet spot for many of these vacant schools. They also have loading bays. You may not realize this, but your public school probably has at least one, if not more, loading bays. And if they don't have a loading bay, the construction and the building design is such that one could easily be put in. The schools that are not in urban areas generally sit on large acreages. 8 to 12 acres is pretty much the standard. And they also, because of federal requirements, have a high level of industrial design and construction. So they're really quality buildings. They also have large spaces, high ceilings, perfect for building materials. And there's lots of parking. And then in New York State, the buildings that we looked at were or are located on or near operational freight lines, which is, an important and interesting consideration when you're talking about a statewide network of building circularity centers and the potential to transfer materials from a particular center or to a particular center, even though we are obviously trying to keep as much of this local for the local community as possible. So just to give you kind of a sense of scale, the population of New York State is 20 million. More than half of that population resides in an urban, very highly suburban area of New York City and Long Island. 62 counties. We currently have about 4,400 public schools and a few hundred charter schools. And so the study that we did, and we'll go into this in a little more detail throughout the presentation, but we just started collecting data in 2023. And when I say we, I mean students, because we have a lot of interns that we put to work on this because it's really time consuming and it can be tedious. We were looking specifically for publicly owned schools that had been vacant for 12 years or less and that were constructed between 1936 and 1976, roughly. What we found at the time that we collected this data, because it's a very fluid situation with new schools opening and schools closing pretty regularly in New York State. At the time that we collected the data, we found 171 vacant schools upstate or outside of New York City in the Long Island area, and 155 vacant schools in the more urban, suburban areas that fit our criteria of publicly owned, vacant for less than 12 years and constructed during the 36-76 timeframe. In New York State, there's no master list. And if you are from a state where there is, we would love to talk to you about that. So we combed through our New York State Education Department site. We looked at real property records. We checked media articles. We were looking at a lot of different sources for this data that we compiled. And after we'd gotten a pretty good, robust list with a lot of different attributes, we got funding from an organization called the Pollution Prevention Institute in New York State to take it to the next phase. And so we were able through this funding to update the list, sort the list based on these buildings' locations and potential environmental justice areas. That was a requirement of the grant funding. We overlaid that with a Regional Economic Development Council map, because as you all know, reuse centers are absolutely economic drivers. And this is a whole economic sector in building reuse that we can be creating. And then we arrived at a final list and we were able to do visits and site assessments. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy now to talk more about this effort.
Thanks, Gretchen. Again, my name's Andrew Roblee. I'm a historic preservation consultant based in Auburn, New York. And as part of this presentation, I'm going to give a brief overview of the evolution and history of school facilities in the US, just to show how we've arrived in the situation we're in, why so many schools sit vacant, and why these buildings are ideal candidates for adaptive reuse as building materials reuse centers. My expertise, of course, is in the Northeast, particularly New York, but there are many commonalities across the country. So once I go through that, I'm going to touch on some available reuse incentives in New York and Arizona. So I have these two photos up here just to show kind of the beginnings of what we might think of as public education. Public school design typically reflects changes in educational philosophy, social values, technology, and architectural trends. And we'll see that as we go across time and see these different buildings come and go. Next slide, please. Okay, so just briefly to talk about early schools. In pioneer settlements, whether they're New York or Arizona, the first school is usually a single room structure. And it's often made from local sources. In Arizona, if you look at the earliest settlements, places like Tucson, Yuma, or Prescott, education often began in more informal settings like homes or churches or rented buildings. Arizona's territorial legislature did not pass public education law until 1871, and that created territorial superintendents. And that the superintendents allowed the counties to form districts and then levy taxes to support the public schools. And then the first official public school under this law was established in Tucson the following year in 1872. So those are the beginnings. Then we move into the era of urbanization and industrialization in America. We're talking the mid to late 19th century. The population was expanding and communities were growing and needed schools with more classrooms and increasingly specialized spaces. So this is when architecture starts to come into its own, and then architects began designing schools, which led to debates over the cost of schools and the cost of school buildings. In New York, standardization emerged in the 1890s as a way to balance the architectural fees with the taxpayers' desire for efficiency. So architects needed to adhere to these standards primarily to make sure that costs were controlled, because if you tell an architect, I want to build this building, they will most likely build the most elaborate and special building that they can conceive of. But most taxpayers don't want to be left with that kind of burden. So this is an example from the 1895 publication Design for Schools, and this was put out by the New York State Department of Ed to provide guidelines for architects and for local school boards on the design of their buildings. And you can see we've moved beyond the single room structure into what we would call slightly more specialized buildings with a classroom, a teacher's office, and then entrances for boys and girls. Next slide, please. Okay, World War I had an extremely deep impact on the design of public school buildings. Mainly, this stemmed from the observation that many recruits, as they came into the Army at 18, sometimes 17, but young adults were physically not prepared for the demands of boot camp and military service. And so the imperative to expand physical education in our schools was made a priority. And so during this period, you also had, we're also in the period of the City Beautiful movement. And so landscape architecture and the design of larger landscapes and the discipline of planning were also coming into their own. So you have all these different forces acting on public school design, and the result is that you have these wider acreages, athletic fields, are now part and parcel of every school design. New gymnasiums, auditoriums. So top-down planning really gained speed and gained momentum across many states during this period. During the Great Depression, the Public Works Administration added vocational shops to schools. These spaces, wood and tech shops, are now ideal for reuse as material processing areas. Some of them, and Gretchen and I have seen firsthand, some of them are still intact with their wood shops, which is pretty remarkable. A lot of the architectural design, like stylistic standards, were set forth by the PWA. So the top right, you'll see this colonial revival school from the very late 1920s, maybe 1930. PWA set the tone for the schools that were to be built. Now, if you go 5 years later or so, all the schools are going to be more Art Deco. Again, those directives came from the federal government. So they're controlling everything from the required spaces, square footage, and even down to the architectural style of the building. After World War II, if you look at the bottom right photo, schools began to adapt to a long and low layout. And you'll notice this in schools built in the 1950s or after. They're typically no more than 2 stories. Sometimes they're 3 stories, but they're spread over larger campuses, and the functional areas of the building are more separated. Next slide, please. So, schools built between 1935 and 1975 often become vacant due to economic shifts, population decline, and mostly school district consolidation. There's many cases in which schools were built only to be empty a few years later because of school district consolidation. And consolidation is driven largely by a few factors. There are population shifts, of course, but also, at least in New York, there is a state mandated building conditions review and construction project cycle every 5 years. And so what this means essentially is that there is a financial incentive to consolidate districts and make buildings obsolete, because each district will get money every year to complete capital projects, and there is a consolidation bonus as well. I haven't done enough research in Arizona to know if that is in place there, but it's pretty widespread. So it's tough when these financial incentives favor new construction over repair, because they contribute to the abandonment of these schools. Next slide, please. Okay, so Gretchen and I, as she noted, we began by taking data from the New York State Education Department, and we ended up with over 300 schools. But as she also added, there are so many others that we anecdotally are aware of, because the state ed's list only went back 12 years in terms of vacancy. So if a school was vacated 15 years ago, it wouldn't be on that list. And there are schools that have been vacant for decades and decades in our area. Next slide, please. Here's just another map that identifies the schools that we were able to reduce our list to. So we cross-reference that with county records, news reports, as Gretchen said, direct phone calls sometimes. And then we map them onto those potential environmental justice areas, which are the little green blobs that you see. And where all those things coincided, we came up with these schools that we studied. Then we moved on, and we decided to figure out how we were going to rank and assess these buildings. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we did is we came up with an assessment matrix where we used both quantitative and qualitative factors to assess the reuse potential. So some of the quantitative metrics we were able to use included the square footage, site acreage. Those are important things to a reuse hub. The building and site condition. In order to assess condition, what we did is we referenced Fannie Mae's 6 property ranking system. They have a 6-level ranking system by which they assess the value of, or condition of properties. And so we did the same thing. We went through all their criteria for each building and assigned a number for that condition. We looked at their historical significance. Now, when I say that's quantitative, what I mean is whether or not it is eligible or is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that is either it is or it isn't. So in that fashion, it is quantitative. Qualitatively, we looked at the zoning requirements in the locality. We tried to understand try to gauge the temperature of the community in regards to a project like this. We researched ownership, which was sometimes necessary just to get access to the buildings to begin with. Some of them are publicly owned, others are private, and may come with more complex histories. We also considered transportation access, as Gretchen showed, schools near rails or major roads, and also the proximity to construction and demolition debris facilities. Next slide, please. So after that, we set up meetings, and we did site visits to those properties which we were able to make contacts with, and which we deemed had more potential. So for example, there was a school, one of our schools was located in the middle of the city of Albany, New York, in a public park. Well, that one was made a low priority just because its likelihood as a reuse facility, while not impossible, was rather unlikely given its setting in a public park. So that one dropped off the list. And so we kind of prioritized like that. Let's move on. So one of my areas of specialization is incentives related to historic properties. And the reason that we were looking at properties listed on the National Register or considered eligible for listing on the National Register is that once a school building is listed, once a property is listed, it is eligible for a 20% federal historic rehabilitation tax credit. In New York State, there is also a state tax credit, which can be paired with that. As far as I know, Arizona does not have that state tax credit, although there was legislation to try and get that as recently as 2023. Arizona does have a historic property tax program, which results in a reduction of property tax between 35 and 45%. That requires the owner to enter into a 15-year agreement, which is basically what amounts to a preservation covenant, which says that the property will be, any proposed work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for historic preservation, which I'll discuss a little bit. I'll go into a little bit more detail with that in a minute. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. I have a couple of extra slides here. I apologize. So a little bit more about the historic rehabilitation tax credit. So what that 20% federal income tax credit what it really means is that the owner or the developer will qualify for a tax reduction, a 20% reduction equal to the qualified rehabilitation expense on the property. So I'm garbling that. So let me back up. A qualified rehabilitation expense is any work done on the property that is qualified by the IRS to that any work sorry, I'm having a malfunction here. So a QRE is a qualified rehabilitation expense, and that is taken from a list provided by the IRS for specific work that can take the credit. And that covers a lot of different things. So the general rule is if you were to take the roof off of the building and turn it upside down, anything that didn't fall out would be covered as a QRE. And so what the tax credit is on those QREs. So 20% of those QREs you can take as a reduction of your income tax bill, or what some developers do is they will syndicate them, which means they sell them to a bank or another company to generate capital. And it's not a dollar for dollar match, but it allows people to get quick capital right away to begin their projects. It makes them more feasible. In New York, there's a 20% credit, follows the same rules. You can pair those, and it gives you up to 40%. So it makes rehabilitating a historic building just that much more feasible from a financial point of view. And schools are often recipients of these tax credits, and they typically are converted into residences. I have to imagine that's happened a lot that's happened in Arizona. They're all over the place in New York State. These Public Works Administration era schools being converted into apartments. There's just a few rules you have to follow, which I mentioned, the Secretary of the Interior standards. Those are some guidelines that have to be met in order for the property to retain its historic integrity. But they are also pretty flexible and allow a great degree of adaptation. For schools, for example, some of the things you would have to retain would be the lockers, if there's terrazzo floors with artwork, the basic corridor structure. Other than that, classrooms can be converted into apartments, so on and so forth. The devil's really in the details when it comes to this program. But with the right analysis in support, a developer could take one of these historic schools, convert them into a reuse hub, and they can be reactivated and really continue to contribute to the communities that they're in. Because once these schools are closed, these community anchors where people spent years of their lives and parents went to meet with teachers and meet with each other, and where people went to vote, and where public events were held, they'll be once again reopened instead of just kind of a sad eyesore, which a lot of these turn into. I think that's my last slide, Gretchen, and I apologize for my stuttering.
So just to wrap up, I think, we are very much of the belief that what is currently viewed as a sense of loss can really be transformed into a building circularity center that brings back a sense of community to a local town or village or city. Many of you I know do these things already. You can collect other materials. In New York State, we have a real problem disposing of mattresses. So a mattress disposal site for reuse, food scrap drop-off, tool lending library, a repair cafe. But we also have thought about, other things like the sense of community that so many of these schools embodied when they were schools. And so a summer movie festival, space for makers classes, an indoor-outdoor golf course made from reclaimed and reused materials. And because we're located in upstate New York, where there are a lot of disused or vacant or falling in our agricultural vernacular structures, the idea of moving some of those onto the acreage and reusing those as well. So a silo could become a bakery, a chicken coop could become a meeting room for architects and designers to look at the materials there and build trade design type of initiative. So the possibilities are endless. In New York State, we have so many schools that we would love to reactivate, and so we are hoping to take this current project to the next phase and actually get a pilot happening so that we can establish a building circularity center in one of these many vacant schools to pilot for the community. So just before we wrap it up, and we're looking forward to your questions and the conversation, as I mentioned, this data collection is tedious. It's also going to have to be done again because it is such a fluid situation. So I just wanted to shout out to all of the students who have helped us with this over the past couple of years. Annie, Kai, Zoran, Divine, Galiba, and Katie did an amazing job and still are they have not gone blind yet with all of the data parsing. So thank you to all of them. And there is our contact information for Andy, for myself, and for Crowd. And so please reach out and get in touch. And I'm going to stop sharing now and happy to answer questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Andrew and Gretchen. That was an amazing amount of information to digest. We do have some comments and points that folks have raised in the chat, but if anybody does have questions, please feel free to either use the virtual hand raise, put your question in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with, because we do still have some time to address some of these. I think the first person in with a question was not quite to the focus that you were discussing, but Allison had asked about work in New York City to develop a program to salvage the amounts of reusable items that are set out for trash. I don't know if that's anything that you guys can speak to, or perhaps even if there's anybody else you'd recommend that Allison contact about that.
At the moment, I believe I'm correct in saying that there is no citywide program in terms of salvaging existing items that are set up for trash. New York City right now is very focused on food scraps and composting. And so that there are citywide programs for that. Some of you may be familiar with an enormous program and project where a university campus in the city is being demolished, although we hope deconstructed, and trying to divert as much as possible from that. It's a project called SPARC, S-P-A-R-C, in Kips Bay, and so that is also taking a lot of focus in terms of the building materials piece of materials management in New York City, and that is currently a project that is happening now. So we at Crowd and at Reclaim NYC and New York City agencies and state agencies are very focused on this particular, I believe it's a 1 million square foot campus. I may have that a little bit wrong.
Okay, thank you. Dennis, I don't know how you say your last name, Milam. Dennis has shared some very interesting information in the chat. And Dennis, if you'd like to unmute yourself and speak to this, he's talking about managing an initiative in Chicago called Creative Grounds for the reuse of the 47 closed schools in Chicago from 2013, currently working at Overton Elementary School. He also references his partner, Paula Aguirre Serrano, who finished a documentary called Beyond Closure about the reuse of 3 schools. I don't know, Gretchen and Andrew, if you and Dennis and Paula already know each other or not.
No, we would love to
No.
meet you.
Okay.
Hi.
Dennis, do you want to share any further information about the initiative that you have been working?
Yeah, I really think that Paula would be best to speak to this, but one of the reasons I came here today is Tom Mulhern from the Reuse Studio in Chicago. He just introduced himself and got introduced to this group here. But this has been an initiative that's been ongoing for Borderless Studio since 2017. In 2013, Chicago had 47, it might have been 44 schools, and then 3 additional schools closed to equate to 47 school closures. What we understand to be the largest in the country, with talks some more. So really what we have been doing is cataloging and understanding what is going to happen with these schools. There seems to be very little thought that is put into this and how they're going to be reutilized when the school closures actually happen. So as of 2017, the way that we got started with this was contacting the developers and understand who purchased some of these schools, because there was an RFP that was put out. And then my partner Paula did some outreach to some developers asking if there's any way to collaborate and keep some of the public grounds active while they're going through their redevelopment process. There was very little interest in having those conversations, but there was one individual, Guion Foreman, who purchased Overton Elementary, and we've been working with him since 2017, activating school grounds, activating the classrooms through art and different types of gallery spaces. During 2020, we actually did some food distribution, mutual aid work on the public grounds there within the neighborhood, and just really making sure that the residents within the community and neighborhood see that it's activated and see that it's not gonna kind of fall to the wayside here. It's a community center that we feel needs to remain active. In all those discussions, as I mentioned in the chat, has been a documentary created called Beyond Closure, which we are having screenings in Chicago actively, and we're looking to provide more screenings to talk about what is happening with these schools. One last thing I'd like to say is that the CPS, Chicago Public Schools, as well as the City of Chicago, had released a RFQ in May or June, and it's coming soon to be due, but they are actually bidding off on the remainder of the schools. I think there's like 23 schools that are remaining. Don't quote me on those numbers, but there's a number of schools that are waiting to be purchased for reuse, and hopefully they can be put back to the community in some way. There was a number of schools back in 2017 that got converted into condos and housing, which is great, right? So putting these schools back to use is always a good thing. A lot of these community centers, though, we are trying to figure out how at least a portion of them can be put back to community use. So if there's any further questions, I'll try my best to answer them. But we look forward to engaging in this conversation.
Wow, thank you, Dennis. That's wonderful. And I'm thrilled for you to be sharing this because, again, it's that benefit of community. The more of us who become aware of these activities, the more we can partner and start to scale those, learn from each other. So thank you for sharing that. And I suspect there's going to be some follow-up conversations coming from this. Thank you. I had actually put a question in the chat. Andrew, I wasn't sure in terms of who actually holds the deeds for these varying properties, really, is it the owner or the restoring entity who's eligible to use the federal and state historic tax credits? And I guess what that turns into is, does that mean if a community owns a property, they have to sell it to a private developer in order to get somebody interested in this, or how does that work?
So the tax credits, you must be a taxpayer to be eligible for the tax credits. Now, that doesn't always mean the actual owner of the property benefits from that. According to the code, a lessee may also qualify for the credits if it's, this, we're talking about the commercial tax credit now. What has happened in the past is that sometimes a development corporation is created by a nonprofit that owns a historic property. That development corporation, they often share board members, but they're created specifically to transfer ownership for the duration of the project and for the 5 years afterwards. So there's a period of 5 years after the project is completed that ownership has to remain in the LLC or whatever you create. Then it can revert back to the nonprofit. So that's a model that's used sometimes by nonprofits and municipalities, people that aren't taxpayers, basically. So there's a model for that. It's a little bit more complicated, but it's usually done at scale for larger projects.
Okay, that makes lots of sense. Thank you. Tom Mulhern, you had, I think you were introducing yourself, but then you'd also raised the question about linking to the effort in New York City for the reuse, what I believe ties into what Dave Bennick has been working around the Reuse Innovation Center. And it looks like there's some follow-up text on that. Anything you wanted to flag there? Okay. Super. Okay. Other folks with questions, feel free to either unmute yourself. Oh, I'm sorry, Kathy Mirza, please unmute yourself and ask.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much. This is a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate what the presenters shared today, because it seems like there's a lot of potential for vacant schools, certainly. And it seems like a lot of work to put the information together, right? It seems like that data piece is huge, and we've started to talk about how that's possible in Massachusetts a little bit. I guess my question has to do with not only gathering that data, but one thing that we have here in Massachusetts is also shuttered state hospitals, even prisons. And I wondered whether buildings like that might be amenable for this sort of building material reuse space. I don't know if the specifications for those buildings might be kind of similar to what Andrew described, that would be, the high ceilings and those characteristics that would be amenable perhaps. And I wondered what the cost proposition might be, from the economic development standpoint, as opposed to, would it be competing with developers who might want to turn that into housing, for example, because we have a real housing pinch in Massachusetts. And I just kind of wondered about that cost proposition piece, as well as other types of buildings that might fit that.
Thank you, Kathy. Gretchen or Andrew?
Hi, Kathy. Good to see you. In terms of, we in New York State also have prisons and hospitals. The ones that are currently where there are plans being put in place, they're generally so much bigger than the schools that we're looking at in terms of the building size and acreage that it seems that it's possible for a reuse facility to be a piece of that campus rather than the full thing. And oftentimes, as you're probably aware, in New York State, they try to pull together a lot of associated parties to really move the planning forward if there is planning that's being done, as opposed to letting them sit vacant. So we did not look at those, but theoretically they would have the same building requirements and construction and design requirements, similar to the development of schools that Andy shared. So it'd be interesting, and would love to share information There are a couple of facilities in the central New York area where we're both located, where there is planning going on for potential future uses. In terms of a cost proposition, we would really like to pilot, one school into a building circularity center so that we can actually see what that looks like. One of the things we've discovered is that the acquisition cost theoretically could be much lower because it's either municipally owned and the municipality really doesn't know what to do with it and would sell it for $1. Or one of the other things that has made this tricky in terms of both the data gathering, but also other issues, is that many times, in fact, when a municipality doesn't know what to do with it, they auction it off. And so some of the schools that you saw that are on our slides have been auctioned off to a private buyer for less than $10,000. And often, so it's sitting in the hands of a private owner, but often that person bought it at auction, but now doesn't have the financial wherewithal to go further with whatever they were thinking. It is seldom a big developer who's come in with a vision for it. It's usually a local person who says, I have $8,000 or $10,000 that I'm going to go to the auction and get the building. And so again, then it sits vacant. And those people, in our anecdotal conversations with many of them, would be really happy to offload their school that they now own, don't know what to do with, for a similar amount. So just in terms of the acquisition costs, that is much more feasible and affordable than something that is potentially in an actual larger developer hands. So in that case, yes. But in terms of the actual financials of rehabilitating one of these into a building circularity center, as Andy and I mentioned, so many of the attributes of these buildings that we've looked at have facilities that are really in pretty good shape. If you were just wanting to run kind of a pretty basic get going and be able to take materials in, sort them, store them, do minimal processing and put them back retailed in the space. So many of them wouldn't have a lot of upfront, adaptive reuse or renovation issues.
Okay. Heather Lennon is flagging the point that it would be very helpful to continue this conversation for those of us in the trenches doing this work. How could we make that happen? What could we do to facilitate connections among the folks who are tackling this in all these different areas? Any suggestions? Are you guys game to be a clearinghouse for people to reach out to you to start to give this legs?
I'm happy to take anybody's emails, communication, that if you've had experience like Dennis in doing this work, or are just interested in your community because you have a vacant school, we'd be really so happy to talk more. This is, like I mentioned at the beginning, this is really a labor of love for me and Andy. We both love all of these terrific, wonderful buildings and would love to see them put back into use. And we're both very involved in our New York State Circular Construction Economy group. And so always happy to talk. And I would note, that to Dennis's point about Chicago, closing 47 schools, I know from our colleagues across the country, that we know through Build Reuse and other networks, that there are similar cities facing these same issues where we're in an area where there's a lot of urban and suburban schools, but there are cities where they're looking at the closure of 20 or 30 schools in a year because of the consolidation and the shifting demographics that Andy mentioned, and really don't know what to do when they're faced with that challenge and are looking for ideas. So I think there is interest in pockets nationally for this.
Thank you. And Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say we're in overtime, so I want to be respectful of everybody's schedules. But one of the things that we will absolutely do, Gretchen and Andrew have authorized us to share their slides. That will include, of course, their contact information at the end, and I think that can help us facilitate some follow-up connections and conversations. Thank you, Gretchen and Andrew. This was fascinating. All the folks who participated. It's exciting that folks are finding each other here, and this could be the beginning of a wonderful partnership. Thank you so much, everybody, and we hope you have a great rest of your week. We will be taking a break for the Valley Sun Work Group for July and August, but we hope to see you again at our September meeting. Thank you again. Have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.
Please do stay around and give us feedback in the survey.